Hello, my name is Jaynee Bowker. I am a student at Knox College where I am double majoring in secondary education and English literature, and today I'm giving a TED Talk style lecture about the importance of teaching diversity in rural, predominantly white schools. So I figured I would start off by just explaining a little bit about why I'm talking about this topic in particular. So I myself attended a rural, predominantly white school. I completed practicum hours in a rural, predominantly white school, and for the time being, I plan on staying in the area. So I will probably be teaching at a rural, predominantly white school. And teaching about diversity is just something that I've been really interested in and really passionate about. And as I began research on this topic, I came across a lesson in my research that really sort of ignited my thinking about this topic on a deeper level. And I will talk about that lesson momentarily. But first, I figured I would show you the demographics of the types of schools I'm talking about. So right here is a chart showing the demographics of the school I did my practicum hours at. So this school in particular, 96.7% of the student body is white, 2.6% is Hispanic, 0.4% is Asian, and 0.4% identify as two or more races. These demographics are very similar to my high school and other rural schools in the area, and teacher and administrator demographics are the same as well. So I decided to include this chart to help illustrate the importance of why we should be teaching diversity in schools such as these. At these schools, our students may not be interacting with people of different races and different ethnicities on a daily basis. And so it's important that we educate our students about diversity so that they're not carrying any prejudices or misconceptions that they may be exposed to in the media, for example. So I mentioned that there was a specific lesson I found in my research that ignited my thinking on this topic on a deeper level. And in this lesson, the teacher was discussing the concept of standard versus substandard English. And the teacher stated, "Stay away from such substandard forms as his self, theirselves, and ourself." Now, immediately, the use of this dichotomy of standard versus substandard English really bothered me because the teacher completely ignored and silenced any discussion or explanation of other English dialects, such as African American Vernacular English. This concept of standard versus substandard English has been and still is used to discriminate against non-white persons who use different dialects. African American Vernacular English in particular has been deemed substandard because it is spoken by Black individuals, and white individuals are the ones who have the power to deem what is correct and are the ones who benefit from this dichotomy. So I realized that through lessons such as these, we are unconsciously reinforcing discriminatory ideas for our students. Now, at the time when I had found this lesson in my research, for one of my education courses, I had just read a couple of articles about white privilege, and specifically the use of language in terms of white privilege. So I have included a couple of quotes from those articles here. And this first quote is from Zeus Leonardo in his article, "The Color of Supremacy Beyond the Discourse of White Privilege." He states, "Racial privilege is the notion that white subjects accrue advantages by virtue of being constructed as whites. Hair texture, nose shapes, culture, and language also multiply the privileges of whites or those who approximate them." So this dichotomy of standard versus substandard English is a concept that has been constructed and enforced by white individuals. The second quote is from Peggy McIntosh in her article, "White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack." And in this article, McIntosh, who is a white woman, discusses the various advantages that she has on a daily basis just from being white. She states, "I can remain oblivious of the language and customs of persons of color who constitute the world's majority without feeling in my culture any penalty for such oblivion." And based on this lesson that I had found through my research, this is true for the students at that school. Any exposure that they have to non-white individuals' languages and dialects is through a white lens, leading to unconscious prejudices. Not only do students remain oblivious to the language of non-white persons, but they also unconsciously learn that the language or patterns of speech of non-white persons are substandard due to lessons such as these, which of course leads to bigger implications with how they view these individuals in general. So, as I was diving into this research, I began asking myself a lot of questions. You know, as an English teacher, how should I handle teaching standard English without reinforcing discriminatory beliefs, especially since I myself am white? And one of the things I realized is that I must be deliberate in how I teach about other cultures and make sure that I expose my students to things they otherwise may not see. So, a bulk of my research came from this book by Linda Christensen titled Reading, Writing, and Rising Up, Teaching About Social Justice and the Power of the Written Word. And overall, this is just a fantastic book. So, I included a quote from Christensen here that I felt sort of encapsulated her whole argument in her book. She states, as teachers, we have daily opportunities to affirm that our students' lives and language are unique and important. We do that in the selections of literature we read, in the history we choose to teach, and we do it by giving legitimacy to our students' lives as a content worthy of study. In other words, we need to affirm that our students' lives and languages are important by including them in the curriculum. Now, Christensen has a section of her book dedicated to this idea of standard versus substandard English and how problematic this dichotomy is. And she does offer a solution. Her solution is to teach it all. She's very deliberate about teaching grammar, making sure her students know that standard English has been and still is enforced by white people in power. Now, of course, we still need to teach standard English because in our society, this is what is acceptable in academia and in the workforce. But when it comes to students' creative writing or their personal writing, Christensen offers a different approach. She explains that if you enforce standard English in students' creative writing and in their personal writing, you're taking away your students' voices and their identities, and you're implying that they aren't valid. We should be encouraging them to use their voices and their dialects in their personal writing. And this is something that we can teach in our literature as well. A great example of an author who blends this idea of standard English with substandard English is Zora Neale Hurston. In most of her pieces, she uses her home dialect along with standard English and blends between them, code switches between them seamlessly. So this is something that we can teach, and it is possible. And ultimately, I hope to incorporate my students' experiences, as well as experiences of those who they may not interact with on a daily basis, in my curriculum. Another book where the bulk of my research came from was from Bruce Penniman's book, Building the English Classroom, Foundation, Support, Success. And in this book, Penniman explains how ELA teachers can take a multicultural stance in the classroom. He explains, ELA educators should look at the high school English classroom as a site for in-depth multicultural education, as a place where difference is respected and embraced. He goes on to talk about how his own school has created an African American literature course, which is great, but it's also unfortunate that we typically tend to only teach multicultural texts in multicultural classes. As Penniman states later on, reading the literature of diversity is good, but learning in the midst of diversity is so much better. So, probably one of his biggest suggestions is to create literary conversations between canonical pieces and multicultural texts. Because for ELA educators, one problem we may have is trying to decide what literature we should include and what we should leave out. And when it comes to the canon, that may be difficult because, typically with works in the canon, they're by white male authors, which may seem to go against what taking a multicultural stance in the classroom should be. But by incorporating these sort of literary conversations, we can have both and have a nice balance between the two. So, just as an example, take The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. It's really hard to teach this book without discussing how race is represented in the novel. So, Penniman suggests to pair this novel with a slave narrative, such as Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. Now, Penniman does explain that there are a lot of pitfalls that we need to make sure we avoid when we introduce multicultural literature. This first pitfall is tokenism. And tokenism is when you teach one multicultural text and claim that it speaks for them all. So that's like saying The Color Purple by Alice Walker speaks to the African American experience, or that Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Soko speaks to the Native American experience. No one text, no one piece of literature can speak for an entire nation or an entire group of people. The next pitfall to avoid is exoticism. And this is when you present multicultural texts as something that is completely foreign or different from what your students are used to. This ends up deepening the divide, as students only see how weird and different the other culture is. Now, the next pitfall is universalism, which is opposite to yet equally dangerous as exoticism. Universalism is when you only present one type of narrative. So, for example, throughout our schooling, we often learn about how non-white individuals have been victimized and oppressed, but we don't always learn about how they have thrived in leadership roles. Now, there was sort of a funny coincidence. So I'm a member of the National Council of Teachers of English, and right before I sat down to film this video, I received one of their weekly email newsletters, and the topic was the power of language. And they included some spot-on resources for what I'm talking about today. They included, peer-reviewed articles, book recommendations, blog posts from their site, just an incredible amount of resources which all really validate and expound on the types of things I'm talking about right now. So I took this quote from a blog post on NCTE's site that was written by a couple of NCTE members and educators who have also published a book for educators about teaching grammar. And I chose this quote because I feel it summarized very nicely my whole talk today, and in general, my work and my passion as an educator. So this quote is from Darren Kravitz and Michelle Devereaux, and they state, "As English teachers, we have a responsibility to include discussions of power, society, and identity when we teach language. Ultimately, language is a form of power, shaping reality, changing minds, getting things done. Grammar instruction, then, should include conversations about using language purposely, but also ethically. This is grammar at work in our lives, and, perhaps, what grammar and language study should be in the classroom." So, I know I have specifically focused on what ELA educators can do to incorporate diversity in the classroom, but I hope the information I provided would be beneficial for teachers of any discipline. And this is just the beginning. It's a lot of work to try to unlearn the myths that we've been taught. And there's a lot more that I could say about this topic, but for the sake of time, I will have to end here. I hope that my talk has at least sparked some interest for you in this topic, and if you're interested in further reading, I've included some slides here with my bibliography, with all the sources I used for this talk. So feel free to pause and take note of any sources that you may be interested in digging into. And with that, all I have left to say is thank you for coming to my TED Talk.